Coming up on the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast.
I think a lot of people listening are probably on board with the idea that the omega-6s are a problem because they're unstable, they lead to oxidative damage, they do have some metabolites that are problematic and drive inflammation. The damaged omega-6s are implicated in, plaque and coronary artery disease, and in pretty much every degenerative state you see these damaged fats. And everything about the omega-6s that's problematic also applies to the omega-3s, but it's even worse for the omega-3s because they have more double bonds, so they're even less stable, meaning that their susceptibility to damage is higher, and the other metabolic problems or issues in the mitochondria are even more exaggerated with omega-3s.
This week, I interviewed pro metabolic health coach and podcast host of Energy Balance Podcast, Jay Feldman. We discussed issues with omega-3s, best sources to cook with, advantages of eating meat versus chicken or pork, the true cause of weight gain, best carbs to add to your diet, and much, much more. Really enjoyed my interview with Jay. I know you will too. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the show. All right, welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. My name is Brian Grin, and for the fifth time, I have Jay Feldman on.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Brian. Happy to be here.
Yeah, great to have you on. I've had you on by yourself, some solos, and then we've been on with Dr. Dom D'Agostino a couple times, but always great to bring you back. And anything new coming up with you down the pipeline?
Nothing too major. I mean, always, new podcasts in the queue and everything. And some of the things we'll talk about today will be kind of previews of a few episodes coming out on insulin resistance. And I know we'll be talking about omega-3s too. We just did a short series on that. So yeah, that's some of the main things right now.
Yeah, and if you haven't already, check out his podcast, Energy Balance Podcast, and that's with you and Mike Fave, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Excellent. And how did you meet Mike? I've always wondered that. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike and I met in college, kind of
Okay.
serendipitously, and both had, a keen interest in health. And so, we became friends and did a lot of research and learning together. So
Very cool. And yeah, I'm excited to have you on. I listened to your podcast, and some of the topics are, I don't want to say controversial, but they're maybe against the mainstream, what you would normally hear from the mainstream. And you did a series on omega-3s. So I thought it'd be cool to bring you on and we can sort of dive into that because, I mean, you hear like Dr. Rhonda Patrick, and I've had Dr. Bill Harris on my podcast, who has a company called Omega Quaint, and they do omega-3 testing, and there's quite a bit of research done that he's been doing for 30 plus years. I would love to get him on with you. I don't know if that'll ever work, but I figured, let's dive into omega-3s a little bit because it is sort of a mixed message out there, and I wanted to just, fill people in on that. So
yeah, and that series that we did was partially sparked by some disagreements that I've, had on podcasts with people about omega-3s. And one of those was with Dom D'Agostino on your podcast not too long ago. We ended up talking about omega-3s. And one of the things he pointed out was some of those Bill Harris studies on the omega-3 content in the phospholipids or the red blood cells and associations with mortality. And so a lot of that series was kind of picking that apart and explaining why just because that relationship is there doesn't mean we should be consuming more omega-3s, and digging into the number of confounding variables there. So
yeah, because I mean, if you listen back to my interview with Dr. Bill Harris, he talks a lot about reduced inflammation. Would you say, and we'll get into a little bit more, I know you're going to bring up some studies and things like that, but are there obviously some benefits to consuming omega-3s, or did you find through your research that it really is just inconsequential?
So what I would say is essentially they might be less harmful than other things, but I wouldn't say that there's really any benefit long-term or in a way that I would want to create a benefit. They can have a short-term or create a short-term reduction in inflammation, but I would say the way through which they do that comes at a cost and is not an ideal way to lower inflammation. So we could talk about that, but that I think is the only kind of benefit you can maybe point to, or increases in certain antioxidant defense systems. But as maybe we'll get into, that's only because they're creating damage, only because they're causing oxidative stress and causing increasing per-oxidative damage. And so I would say mostly the benefits are not actually benefits. And when it comes to looking at omega-3s in the membranes, interestingly, one of the things that can signify is a lack of oxidative stress. So you have this chicken or the egg situation where is adding the omega-3s helpful, or is the fact that we see the omega-3s actually a product of a lack of inflammation or a lack of oxidative stress? And I would say it's more of the latter. And that's because in states where we see increases in oxidative stress, the omega-3s in the membranes get damaged and then get removed. So that's one of the confounding variables here, where if you were to just look at the omega-3 content in the membrane, that can just be a sign of a lack of overall inflammation and oxidative stress, as opposed to something that's actually being driven by the omega-3s or omega-3 consumption.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, because like I was recently listening to Rhonda Patrick talk about like marine omega-3 fatty acids and how they can might be able to lower cancer and cardiovascular disease risk. I'm curious to know, like, obviously you can find a study for anything, right? And it's like a lot of times people don't necessarily dive deep into studies. They'll just sort of read the outer layer and be like, oh, okay, that works for omega. But like that's one thing I like listening to your podcast is you definitely dive into studies. Perhaps if you want to share a few with us, if you're watching on YouTube, you can share a screen and show us a few that sort of has led you down this path of, your opinion regarding omega-3s.
Sure. And to preface that, what I would say is I think a lot of people listening are probably on board with the idea that the omega-6s are a problem because they're unstable, they lead to oxidative damage, they do have some metabolites that are problematic and drive inflammation. The damaged omega-6s are implicated in, plaque and coronary artery disease, and in pretty much every degenerative state you see these damaged fats. And the everything about the omega-6s that's problematic also applies to the omega-3s, but it's even worse for the omega-3s because they have more double bonds, so they're even less stable, meaning that their susceptibility to damage is higher, and the other metabolic problems or issues in the mitochondria are even more exaggerated with omega-3s. And part of what we'll get to, and I think it'll be something that's in the study, is actually what they find is replacing linoleic acid in the phospholipids with DHA is worse, actually leads to worse outcomes because the omega-3s are much more unsaturated. In this case, DHA has, I want to say, maybe 4 more double bonds. It's about 8 times as susceptible to damage versus linoleic acid. So that's one kind of big picture thing to consider. Some other considerations before bringing up the study is just that we have, on one hand, this susceptibility to damage, but we also have this incorporation into the structure of the mitochondria, of all the cells, and the phospholipids. And that's something we've kind of been touching on. When we eat the omega-3s, there will be some increased deposition in the actual cellular structure. Now, there's a huge problem with that, and that's encapsulated in what's called the membrane pacemaker theory of aging, which is essentially something that points out that when we have more polyunsaturated fats, more unsaturation in the membranes of the mitochondria specifically, it leads to increased per-oxidation, increased oxidative stress. It leads to much less efficient energy production because these fats are very unstable and therefore they're permeable to different ions kind of passing through in a way that we don't want. So just to get into a minute detail, when it comes to how our mitochondria actually produce energy, it essentially depends on creating a charge by moving protons, which are positively charged, to one side of the mitochondria. And then it kind of works like a battery. It uses that charge to then produce ATP. And when we have more unsaturated fats in the membrane, we essentially have a leaky layer there that allows for those protons to leak back through. And so it leads to much less capacity for energy production, for ATP production. In addition to that, there's other aspects of the cell that then essentially become leaky to ions like sodium and potassium, which then requires energy to bring those ions back to where they're supposed to be. We want to keep the sodium out and bring the potassium in, and that requires ATP. And so those couple of things, coupled with the increased oxidation or susceptibility to per-oxidation, is so dramatically impactful that this membrane pacemaker theory of aging basically suggests that this is the number one determinant of lifespan among all species or between all species. So the main reason why we live longer than a rat or that a pigeon lives longer than a rat is due to the amount of unsaturated fats in these membranes. And this is then also corroborated when we look within a species. When we look among all the rats, the ones with the least unsaturation are going to live the longest, essentially. And also, not only just like lifespan, but also health span and degeneration, and all of that is implicated here. So that's kind of the big picture, or like kind of the preview that I think will be really helpful. And when we pull up the study, it'll be supporting that and also showing what happens when we add in omega-3s as a supplement.
And when you touch on omega-3s, are you talking about simply just the supplementation of it, or are you also referring to just like having salmon and things like that are higher in that? Yeah.
Yeah, so it doesn't make much of a difference, right? The omega-3 content of our food is going to directly increase the omega-3s that are available to be put into the phospholipids. And the difference, one thing that's sometimes brought up is, that different forms of omega-3s are less or more susceptible to damage. And that's true when we're talking about something outside the body. But by the time it gets digested and then absorbed, those differences don't really matter anymore. And even with the omega-3s in the quote most stable forms in something like cod liver oil, we find that even just digestion alone leads to peroxidation of the fats. Even if it was perfectly stable and unperoxidized before we consumed it, if we then consume it, it gets peroxidized just in the digestive tract. Not even considering that then we absorb it, then it's continually exposed to 98.6 degrees of body temperature. It's used in the mitochondria where there's lots of oxygen and free radicals flowing around. A lot of, it's a very reactive environment. And, we can try to protect the omega-3s that we're consuming by putting them in dark amber bottles and keeping them in the fridge, but we're putting them into a very reactive environment once we consume them. And so when we look at, supplementation of omega-3s with antioxidants, looking at pharmaceutical grade fish oil, and then the downstream effects in humans, in athletes, and in healthy humans, we see increased lipid peroxidation. And the antioxidants or consuming vitamin E alongside it is not enough to fully combat this. And we still see elevated levels of lipid peroxidation. So the short of it is regardless of the source, this effect seems to happen.
Interesting. And are there studies? I know you were going to pull up some in a second here. Are there studies done on humans for this, or is most of the stuff you found is done on rats or animals? Or
there's a lot of studies showing that the consumption of omega-3s in humans in different forms, very optimal forms, again, pharmaceutical grade fish oil or cod liver oil, with antioxidants in healthy humans still leads to considerably elevated lipid peroxidation. What we don't have in humans is lifelong studies of humans fed higher or lower amounts of omega-3s and then seeing the impact on different conditions or on lifespan or mortality or things like that. And that's because it's not feasible to do that in studies, that just doesn't exist. So when we're trying to look at that sort of effect, we have to look at animals. And we want to consider that when we're looking at animals, sometimes there are differences in physiology that are important and mean that we can't extrapolate certain outcomes to humans. But that's not the case here. There's nothing here to suggest, at least that we know of, that when we're looking at all these different animals, and this again applies regardless of which animal we're looking at, but also again in humans, like we see all of the same mechanisms occur in humans. There's no way to test this sort of outcome because we can only give humans omega-3s for so many years and then look at some outcome. And of course, whatever outcome is going to be affected not only by what they did those couple of years, but what happened the 50 years prior in their lifetime. So those sorts of studies just can't exist in humans yet.
and maybe just for the audience to understand, because I know you talk with terminology and sometimes people don't always understand everything you're saying, but like lipid peroxidation, maybe explain that and why that could be harmful.
Yeah, so it's essentially lipids are just fats, and peroxidation is essentially just damage. We're talking about fats that are getting damaged. We can think about this if we put some fat in a pan and the pan is too hot and it starts to turn brown. We've got oxidation there. We've got damage to the fat. And that's essentially what we're concerned about happening internally in our digestive system, in our blood, but also especially in the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cell. It's where we produce energy. It's a very reactive situation. You can think of it like a nuclear reactor. Like there's a lot going on in a very controlled manner. But if you put something that's really flammable or very vulnerable into that sort of reactive organelle, it's dangerous. And that's essentially what we're seeing. So lipid peroxidation is the damage to a fat. And we see it a lot with the unsaturated fats, the polyunsaturated fats, whereas the monounsaturated and saturated fats are incredibly stable, hundreds of times more stable than the unsaturated fats.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why you talk about like cooking in perhaps like coconut oil or would you say butter? What would you say the best things to maybe cook in? Because that's where that can come into play quite a bit, right?
Yeah, I mean, my general recommendations would be coconut oil, butter, and beef tallow, or other tallow is probably the best sources. Ghee works as well, and somebody for whatever reason doesn't like those. Sometimes olive oil or avocado oil are okay, but I prefer not to cook with those because they still have about 10% of their fats as PUFA, as polyunsaturated fats. But if you're cooking at a super high temperature, we would want to use ghee over butter, right? Butter can burn at very high
Hmm.
temperatures, so we want to consider something like that. But as long as it's not burning, those would be the fats I would favor.
Okay, got it. Yeah, when you mentioned that it can turn brown, my wife makes these brown butter cookies, and you actually have to burn the butter, and so it turns for the cookies. And she doesn't make them a lot, so I'm not eating it, but they're unbelievable. So, but
Yeah. And again, like that's not the worst thing. We're much more concerned about that happening internally on a consistent basis. I'm the even then, even like the butter that's burning there, I'm pretty sure the burnt parts are more like some of the proteins getting damaged and some of the lactose in there. I'm sure there's some of the fat, but ghee is the exact same fat as the butter. So the only difference in stabilization there is just due to the, purifying the butter or purifying the fat and separating it out from the protein and sugar components. So I think those are the ones that are actually more getting damaged anyway.
okay. Did you want to share your screen and just touch on the study that you sent over? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So this is a study titled Membrane Fatty Acid Unsaturation, Protection Against Oxidative Stress and Maximum Lifespan, Homeoviscous Longevity Adaptation. And a lot of words there, but it's we're just going to go through a few of the figures and kind of keep it simple. But there's a kind of broad quote here that I think is a good starting place where they state, aging is a progressive and universal process originating endogenously that manifests during post-maturational life. Available comparative evidence supporting the mitochondrial free radical theory of aging consistently indicates that two basic molecular traits are associated with the rate of aging and thus with the maximum lifespan: the presence of low rates of mitochondrial oxygen radical production and low degrees of fatty acid unsaturation of cellular membranes in postmitotic tissues of long-lived homeothermic vertebrates in relation to those of short-lived ones.
That's
I guess
quite the sentence right there.
yeah. But to simplify it, because it's using a lot of like complex wording, but it's actually a
Yeah.
pretty simple concept, which is just that it's basically saying there are two main drivers of aging and lifespan. One is how much reactive oxygen species are produced in the mitochondria, and the other is the amount of unsaturation in the cellular membranes and the mitochondrial membranes. And what I would say is, even then, and this has been, I think, more clearly identified, is since the unsaturation of the membranes is such a large determining factor of the oxygen radical production, you could really just isolate it to just that as the main driver of aging and lifespan between species. Of course, if you took the same species and they had the same saturation index, and then one had a lot more oxidative stress and one had a lot less, the one with more would age faster and have more degeneration. So,
Right. So pretty much membrane fatty acid unsaturation is detrimental, right? And you're more prone to oxidative stress.
right, exactly.
And you're
Yeah.
saying that consuming omega 3s, since they're so unstable, you're more prone to getting this unsaturation and being exposed to and being, guess, harmed from oxidative stress. Is that correct?
Right. And the omega-3s are the unsaturation, right? When we consume those, they get inserted into the membranes and increase the unsaturation there. And yeah, and as I was saying, there's the oxidative stress component and also the major differences or impacts on energy production, where when we have more of these unsaturated fatty acids, it really reduces the efficiency of how well we produce energy. And that's huge. It makes a really massive effect as well as the oxidation.
Why do you think there's such a, like when we talked to Dr. Dom D'Agostino and he referred to those. Have you looked at those studies that have shown to help that if you have a higher omega-3 index, that your lifespan will increase, like these anti-aging benefits regarding omega-3s? Why is there such a discrepancy when you see that study compared to the other studies? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I was kind of touching on in the beginning. There's a number of confounding variables. two of the most important. So one is the oxidative stress and inflammation component. If we're more inflamed and dealing with more oxidative stress, it damages the omega-3s, and then they get removed from the membranes. They get removed from the phospholipids. So if you look at two people and one has more omega-3s in the phospholipids and one has less, that might have absolutely nothing to do with how many they consume, but rather the fact that the ones that have less have been under more inflammation, more oxidative stress, and knowing that that's a driver of aging, it's a driver of degeneration, that alone can account for why it looks better, like why the ones who have more omega-3s live longer. It's not because they consume more omega-3s, it's because they've been under less oxidative stress, less inflammation. So that's one confounding variable. Another huge one is omega-6 intake. So there's competition between omega-6s and omega-3s in terms of the amount we consume and then how much gets incorporated into these phospholipids. And so we can consume very low amounts of omega-3s and just change the omega-6 content of our diet, and that will dramatically affect the omega-3 content of the membranes or of the phospholipids. So there's an example in the Maasai, which is a native population that consumes extremely low omega-3s. I want to say it's like 0.15% of their diet. And they also consume low amounts of omega-6s. It's not as low as it could be, but it's still very low, especially compared to the standard American diet. So I want to say about 9% of their fat is from omega-6s. And
what's the Maasai diet like? Is that a lot of potatoes and things like that?
No, they're mostly relying on milk. So they do a lot of milk and some meat and some carbohydrates as well from, like honey and things like that. But largely milk based actually. And that might not be what their diet always was historically. They, I believe, have been moved from where they used to kind of live, and some diet has changed over time. I might be conflating a little bit with the Hadza, who I know they are not as milk based, but I know that they were moved from there, like originally where they were. So anyway, that's a butchering of the general Maasai diet, but at least largely milk based and meat as well.
So that either way, they are very low in omega-3s, but also low in omega-6s.
Right. And so what they find is that they have a relatively high amount of omega-3s in their membrane and in their phospholipids of the red blood cells, of their mitochondria, just because their omega-6 intake is relatively low. So even though they still have a high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, their total amount of omega-6 consumption is very low, at least compared to, Western population. And that alone leads to a pretty large increase in the amount of omega-3s that are incorporated into the structure. So that leads to this other really clear confounding variable, which is that if we just eat less omega-6s, and this could be, someone who's just on a low-fat diet, they're going to eat less omega-6s, or someone who's trying to avoid, processed foods and fried foods, that's going to lower omega-6s. Those are probably some of the main sources in Western diet. If you're just doing those things, you'll see higher amounts of omega-3s in the membranes and in the phospholipids, even if there's no increase or
what if
no
someone said, what if someone said they want to still eat their processed foods and their fried foods, but then they'll just supplement with omega-3s, and then that'll counteract that ratio. And
well, and it might, but what we're more getting at is that because those original studies are just saying, here are people with more omega-3s in their red blood cells and the phospholipids, here are people with less, the ones with more live longer, so we should then consume omega-3s. And what I'm pointing out here is the ones who have more could just be doing that because they're generally healthier, they have less inflammation and less oxidative stress, could be totally independent of diet. And then the other piece is they could just be eating much less omega-6s. They could still be consuming nearly no omega-3s. And they do these studies where they take someone on a Western diet and just lower their omega-6 intake and don't change the omega-3 intake at all. And they see the omega-3 intake, or the omega-3 content of the cellular structure of these membranes and phospholipids, increase. And so you can have that sort of population that I would say, okay, they're definitely going to be healthier, much less PUFA, much less omega-6. And yet they didn't increase the omega-3s at all. It had nothing to do with omega-3 consumption, but you'll see that they're going to live longer because they're generally healthier. So when you have confounding variables like that, I think it makes it really tough to say people who have more omega-3s in the structure of their cells live longer, so we should eat more omega-3s. I think you could just as well say people who have more omega-3s in their cellular structure live longer, so we should minimize oxidative stress and inflammation, and we should reduce omega-6 intake, as those could be more of drivers there than omega-3s.
Okay. So I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Because I mean, I don't know historically how much money is spent supplementation wise, but I would imagine that omega 3s is probably one of the most money spent on, as far as supplementation is concerned.
Yeah, I think it's the third one of the studies that we cite in our omega-3 series says that it's the third most purchased or like third most common supplement
Yeah.
in the US. So yeah, it's a huge industry for sure.
And you would say, obviously, not necessary. Just focus on lowering your PUFA consumption, which will lower your omega 6s.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Main culprits, fried foods. That's probably the big one. Processed foods. Probably anything that most things that have a label. There's probably some form of it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people were told to cook with vegetable oils, so that,
Right.
that's another source. I think in the healthy leaning population and people who are already trying to be healthy, the fried foods and cooking with vegetable oils is less common. But in that case, we can still have large sources of omega 6s from nuts and seeds and fatty chicken and fatty pork. The chicken and pork, it really depends on what they're consuming. So if they're consuming a lot of omega 6s, their fat will contain a lot of omega 6s. So that can be another large source for people. And I think those ones are talked about less relative to like the seed oils. And yeah, I would definitely consider those as well, especially if you've already cut out the seed oils, but we're still doing a lot of nuts and seeds, which are where those oils come from, or we're eating a lot of fatty pork or fatty chicken that is not well raised or is raised eating a lot of those omega 6s. Those are huge sources of omega 6 and PUFA overall.
Yeah. Do you have not? I'm not saying that for this. Maybe on our next episode, but like as far as chicken is concerned, because chicken is consumed so like it's so abundant, especially in the States, and it's quote unquote a healthy food, but obviously it can be very high in omega 6s and PUFAs. Have you seen any studies or anything around how chicken it can be, might not be healthy necessarily as people think?
No, I haven't really looked
Okay.
for it either.
I'd
So
just be curious. Yeah, I mean, we know that like chickens and pigs, their digestive system is a lot different than the way like cattle are, right? They when they consume something, it goes straight to their fat membrane. Is that correct?
yeah, like us, right? So cows
Yeah.
have these massive digestive systems. They have four stomachs, essentially, a ton of bacteria, and they can convert unsaturated fats to saturated fats, and they do. So even if cattle are fed, all their fat is still going to be almost all saturated and monounsaturated. But for us, or chickens and pigs, if we consume all PUFA, it's going to really change the composition of our fat and everything, and that's not good.
Yeah. I'd just be curious to know, like, if you have someone that is a lean, healthy individual versus someone who is overweight and, let's just say obese, like what are their PUFA levels and what are the differences between the two of them?
Yeah,
We should come up with a PUFA index.
we
Like they have
should.
the
And
omega 3 index, we should come up with a PUFA index,
yeah,
right?
definitely,
I don't
and
know.
like comparing that to the mono and saturated fats, and I think they
Yeah.
do that with some of these fatty acid tests as well.
So, okay, we've hit on that. Let's get a little bit into, and you've talked about it with Mike on your podcast, because this is another sort of, I think, maybe big misconception is that weight gain is not caused by excess energy. A lot of times people will just be like, well, this individual's overweight because he's probably just been in an excess of calories over the last 20 years and it's just added up over time. Now, there might be a little bit of truth behind that, right? I don't think it's a black and white thing, but I'm just curious to know your thoughts around that. And I know you and Mike have talked about it.
Yeah, so I have a couple of issues with the notion that if we're gaining weight, we're just eating too much, and the solution is to eat less or to burn more by exercising more or maybe cold baths and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think that that's really not good advice. I don't think it's actually getting at what is causing the issue. Even if you wanted to say it was calorie excess, there's physiological reasons why we would eat beyond what we would need, and those are not solved by just saying eat less, because then we're just hungry and forcing ourselves to lose weight using willpower. And I don't think that A works well, and B, I think it comes at a cost, and we'll kind of dig into that cost. But also, I think it's totally ignoring what would lead to overeating in the first place. So that's part one. And then part two, I think, is the idea that excess calories equals weight gain, I think is just missing It's just missing a lot. There's so many steps between those two things that I think it's really not, I just think it's entirely inaccurate for a number of reasons. So, for one, I mean, to step back, the idea that we could calculate to the calorie how much we burn in a day and how much we consume in a day is just, we're just kidding ourselves. If you want to go into a metabolic ward, sure, you can identify exactly how many calories you might burn in that specific day with that specific activity, that specific amount of sleep you had the night before, that specific amount of light, all of those things in that particular instance. But most people aren't doing that. And all of those other factors I mentioned will affect what we expend and how many calories, we're running through, so to speak. But then on the other side, the idea that we can actually accurately to the calorie estimate not only our intake, but how many calories get absorbed is just incredibly far-fetched. So there are a number of studies looking at, the calorie count of certain foods, and we look at the label and it says the number of calories, and then they actually measure it. And there's always several percentage points off at least, if not like 30% sometimes. And we don't we pretend like that doesn't exist. Like these are exact measures, and they're really not. There's one study I think on almonds that was showing like a huge percentage difference. And it's not only with that, and then you also have the factor of digestion and absorption. So not only does the composition of the food matter, how much fiber, are we eating it with other foods? Is it on an empty stomach? All of that will affect how much we absorb, but also our digestive state. How well are we breaking down the food? Do we have a lot of bacteria that are also competing for the food? And all of those things affect how many calories actually get absorbed from what gets taken in. So to act as though, we can measure that we ate an extra 50 calories every day, and, after a month that was 4,500 calories, so now we've gained a pound and a half or just under in terms of body fat, is just not, it's just irrelevant. It's so far from what we could ever actually account for.
Do you think there's any benefit? Because I mean, you hear like a lot of individuals, for example, like Lane Norton is a big like calories in, calories out guy. And do you think there's any benefit to tracking your calories, at least initially?
Yeah, so I'm not trying to say this is a worthless measure, let's throw it out. At the moment, it's the best measure we have for getting a general idea of the potential energy in food. And that doesn't mean, of course, that 20 calories of protein equal 20 calories of fat or anything else. Like we can't equate things based on calories, but we can get a general idea of around how much we're eating. And it makes more sense to use calories than weight, right? To say that we ate 3 pounds of food one day doesn't really help us because we have to include water weight. And there's also a difference in density of potential energy from fat versus carbs and things like that. So calories are the best estimate we have, but we just don't want to treat it as though it is a perfectly accurate measure, or B, a perfectly applicable measure. But if we want to get an idea of are we eating more now than we were before or less, calories are going to be our best option. And same thing with estimating our expenditure. If we want to get a general idea of how our metabolic rate is changing, calories are our best option for that.
Yeah. What are other ways to understand our metabolic rate? I know a lot of times with, Dr. Ray Peat talked about it was body temperature and things like that. What are other ways to understand our metabolic rate?
Yeah, so body temperature and pulse rate are both good indicators of our metabolic status. If those are low, if our temperature instead of hitting 98.6 in the afternoon is getting to 97.6, that's a pretty clear sign of a low metabolic state, low metabolism, low metabolic rate. And just to be clear, that doesn't necessarily mean we would see a difference in terms of our calorie expenditure, but rather where those calories are coming from or how they're being expended. So we can be under more stress and have a low basal metabolic rate, but have higher stress hormones that are kind of making up the difference. But, those can be generally good measures, and you can use how you feel as well. Do you have a lot of energy? Are your hands and feet cold? Do you feel cold? Do we have brain fog? Those kinds of things can give us an indication as well. We can look at blood work too if we wanted to, get a thyroid lab, a panel. Those things can give us some information. But yeah, also, again, speaking of estimations, looking at our calorie intake now versus before is another great way to do it. Are we eating 500 calories more and maintaining our weight? If so, that's a pretty good sign that we've increased our metabolic rate. And something I know you mentioned in your journey of bringing carbs in and eating a bit more and kind of reducing the time restricted eating and all of that is,
Mm-hmm.
you're able to eat more now and maintain your body weight. So
Yeah. Yeah, that was something I added in and was mainly doing about 2 meals a day. I added in a third meal, just felt like I couldn't get enough, wasn't consuming enough for my, sort of activity level. And no, it's been good. I think initially I might have put on a little bit of weight, but then it sort of just like flattened out and got back to pretty much what I was before, which was a good sign.
Yeah, yeah.
So, so I think the point is that the calories in calories out model is just it's just too much of a simplified model to look at things, right? There could be so many other variables that could affect weight gain, whether it's, maybe you like, if would you say if someone's not getting results and every day they eat chicken, would you say that that could be a variable that's affecting, their weight loss journey?
You're saying because of the PUFA content?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and what I will say, an important piece there is if you're eating chicken breast, there's very little fat in there, and so there won't be much PUFA.
Okay.
So that won't matter. But if you're eating a lot of chicken thighs or legs, or you're making a broth and consuming all the fat with it, that would be a large source of PUFA. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So calories don't equal energy. Perhaps dive a little bit into that. I know you've talked with Mike about that, and a lot of times people think that that's just like a one-to-one relationship.
Yeah. And so that's the biggest, to me, elephant in the room that we didn't get to yet is there's all these issues with estimating calories in and calories out and all of that. But the biggest issue that I have with this calories in, calories out equals change in weight or change in mass equation is that it's completely ignoring the fact that calories don't equate to energy. And it is so universally like ingrained that people will say those as if they're the same things. People will say energy balance when they're just talking about calories in and calories out. They'll talk about calories in as energy in, but there's a huge problem there, which is there are a lot of things that have to happen for us to go from a calorie, quote unquote, in a food into ATP, into energy. The food has to be taken in, has to be broken down through digestion, and then has to be absorbed, then has to be taken to some tissue where it's going to be converted to energy. And then we have to actually go through that conversion process, which requires, in the case of carbohydrates, we have to go through glycolysis and then the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain. With fat, we go through beta oxidation and then Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. And there's a lot of areas for those things to go wrong. And so in this paper that, I'll share a quote from in a moment, what they basically point out is that in people who are gaining weight or who are obese or dealing with this kind of issue, they actually aren't converting the food that's coming in, those calories, so to speak, into energy very effectively. There's various blockages, and they point out a certain enzyme in the Krebs cycle, but there's a ton of other places that we can have blockages in terms of other enzymes in the enzymes in the TCA cycle and the Krebs cycle, enzymes in glycolysis, in complexes of the electron transport chain. There's all these places where there can be inhibition due to a nutrient deficiency, due to oxidative stress, due to endotoxin, due to PUF. And those are going to reduce how efficiently we can convert the fuel coming in into energy, to convert the potential energy into actual usable energy in ATP. And when that happens, we then have excess fuel, and that fuel then gets directed to be stored. That's another way of saying we have a low metabolism because we're not converting the fuel well to energy. So we have a lack of energy. And at the same time, we're converting excess amounts of the fuel or the substrate into body fat. And this is exactly what they describe in this study. And it's the exact opposite of what we're told, right? We're told that obesity, or if you're gaining weight, this is a state of excess energy and you have excess ATP. And then there's a spillover because we don't need more ATP. So we just keep converting all the extra substrate to fat. But what's really happening is we have a lack of ATP and we're not able to effectively convert the fuel to energy, to ATP. So then there's leftover fuel and it gets converted to fat. So we have low energy and fat gain at the exact same time. And what that does is the low energy directly impacts our hunger signals. So in the liver and in the hypothalamus of the brain, these are basically our two sensors of our energy state and determinants of our hunger. And so if we have a lack of ATP in those places, we're then going to continue to have hunger signals, even though we're storing fuel as fat, because we have a lack of energy. And that energy is essential. That's how our bodies function. We need that ATP. So then you have the state where, sure, then there's overeating, then there's even more fat storage, but the overeating isn't the problem. That's a product. That's an effect of issues with energy production, of inhibition of energy production. And so I would say that is the clear like illustration of what's actually going on in someone who's gaining body fat, and eating less and exercising more just makes that worse. It just leads to less energy, and over time actually makes it even worse in terms of converting that fuel into energy and then storing even more body fat. And we'll go through another study very briefly on that too.
Yeah, let's pull that up. That was well said. I mean, I think a lot of people think that, oh well, you're overweight, so you're just consuming too much. But it's much more complicated than that, right? That food is not converting into energy and ATP as efficiently as someone that is, metabolically healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So to share the quote, this is a paper titled Decreased Energy Levels Can Cause and Sustain Obesity. And it's a great paper to look through, but just kind of in their summary, they state, we begin with the contradictory information that in obesity, more calories are consumed than used up, suggesting that obese people should have excess energy. On the other side, obese people experience fatigue and decreased physical endurance that indicates diminished energy supply in the body. The result of our work is a chain of metabolic events leading to obesity. The crucial event is the inhibition of the TCA cycle at the step of aconitase. It disturbs energy metabolism and results in ATP deficiency with simultaneous fat accumulation. Further steps in obesity development are the consequences of diminished energy supply, and this would be inhibition of beta oxidation, leptin resistance, increase in appetite and food intake, and a decrease in physical activity. Thus, our theory shows that obesity does not have to be caused by overeating and sedentary lifestyle, but may be the result of the obese change in metabolism, which is forcing people to overeat and save energy to sustain metabolic functions of cells. This obese change is caused by environmental factors that activate chronic, low-grade inflammatory process in the body, linking obesity with the environment of developed countries. So they kind of laid out exactly what we just described, and they really focus on this inhibition of aconitase, a particular enzyme of the TCA cycle. But there's a number of different places that respiration, that mitochondrial energy production can be inhibited. And they basically point out that that is the driver. And then something like overeating is happening as a result of that. And this is essentially the obesity state, is a low energy state.
Very interesting. Yeah. So overeating is the result of your body not being able to metabolize that food in a correct manner. So that's what would you say are reasons or some of the main reasons why sort of this process could be, I guess, screwed up or not efficient and resulting in overeating?
Yeah, and just to add in also,
Yeah.
so they mention that the overeating is a consequence of low energy supply, and they also mention that leptin resistance fits in there as well. And this is something that's so often focused on, is that, if we're obese, if we're overeating, it's an issue of leptin resistance. But what they point out in this paper is that leptin resistance is just an effect of a lack of ATP, because the lack of ATP is more important. If a cell, or let's say the whole liver, has a lack of energy but is getting the signal leptin saying stop eating, that the lack of energy overrides that signal. It's so much more important to our physiology. So leptin resistance isn't actually, kind of like insulin resistance, isn't actually about, excessive production of leptin and the cells just stop responding to it because they've gotten tired of responding. But rather, it's because there's something more important going on, which is a lack of energy, and that trumps the leptin signal. But yeah, so the question of what kinds of things cause this lack of energy, what kinds of things diminish the ATP supply, what kinds of things interfere with mitochondrial respiration. We touched on one of the biggest, which is the polyunsaturated fats. And so reducing those in favor of mono and saturated fats, I would say, is key. That's probably universally, if we're just looking at the human population right now, I think that's probably the biggest one. A second one, which is, I would say, probably the next biggest one, would be the production of toxic byproducts from bacteria in the intestine. And so normally this is considered, or these toxins are called endotoxin, which often refers to lipopolysaccharide, which is a component of bacterial cell walls, and it's also just produced by the bacteria. But endotoxin can also be a broader term to incorporate or refer to other toxic things produced by bacteria or fungi. And these are implicated in obesity, in diabetes, in heart disease. We see this endotoxin component. And if we look at the effects of endotoxin on, or just specifically lipopolysaccharide, on mitochondrial respiration, we see inhibition along the electron transport chain. And what that means is that this main site for producing ATP, we're getting blocked by this lipopolysaccharide produced from the gut. If we have overgrowth of bacteria, or we're not digesting our food well and it's excessively feeding bacteria, those kinds of things will lead to excess endotoxin, which will interfere with our ability to produce energy. And that also causes a cascade of oxidative stress and inflammation, increases nitric oxide. And those things are focused on in this paper, where they talk about how excess nitric oxide and reactive nitrogen species and inflammation and oxidative stress will inhibit enzymes like aconitase. Nitric oxide will also directly inhibit cytochrome C oxidase, which is complex 4 of the electron transport chain. And when those things happen, you get this backup where we're not converting the fuel to energy and we begin to shunt it toward fat storage. So those would be two of the biggest ones. We also have things like nutrient deficiencies, chronic stress, heavy metals, if we're exposed to large amounts of heavy metals or something like that. I mean, there's pretty much anything that affects us negatively does so through the effects on our capacity for energy production.
Yeah. And chronic stress is a big one, I think, for a lot of people. I had an individual come up to me and he's felt like he's been doing the right things, but he's not getting where he wants to go. And, then we started getting into stress, and that was sort of like that was sort of the big red flag, I think, is that excess stress. And I know and Dr. Ray Pete talked a lot about, like, when you talk about stress, I think a lot of people think about like environmental factors and outside factors, or just daily things that you're doing. But what other ways could people be causing stress on their bodies?
Yeah, so there are all of the psychological factors and, a lack of sleep, which can increase our susceptibility to stress and affect our hormonal state, stress from our jobs, financial stress and time stress and all of those things. I mean, that's without a doubt a huge component here, and we don't want to ignore that, and that will contribute to all these things, like to this dysfunction, to this impairment in energy production. But we also want to consider physiological stresses or stressors. And that'll be things like, for one, I mean, the absence of carbs or calories. So low carb or lower calorie diets, or even low fat, particularly low fat diets, all of those can cause a stress response because we don't have the fuel that we need in the areas that we need it. And essentially, it's another way of causing low energy just due to a lack of fuel. And that'll create stress, which will then further impair our ability to convert fuel to energy. We also have, I mean, various things that we could consume in our food, like pollutants and, plasticizers and pesticides and things like that, that'll contribute in a physiological way and also impair our capacity for energy production. We have excess exercise as basically causing a very similar effect to a low calorie diet. And that sort of excess chronic stress will create the same effect. And we can do it a number of other ways, right? We can do it through a combination of cold baths and fasting and whatever else. And those are all intense stressors as well, causing the same physiologically stressful processes.
Got it. Yeah. And so the main two things that are causing this sort of, I'd say, lack of energy or lack of ATP is PUFAs and this endotoxin accumulation. Those are like the two big ones, would you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think those are always the best starting places.
And the last thing I wanted to touch on is you mentioned it during our last interview, was that you said, and we can get into details, so I just want to bring it up this time, is that fat burning is a state for diabetics. Because you hear a lot of times people are like, well, you want to get into a fat burning state, but this might not necessarily be advantageous for people. And maybe explain to that what you mean by that.
Yeah. So there is this notion that insulin resistance and diabetes are characterized by a lack of fat burning. But what we really find is that what's going on in terms of energy production is there's impairments in glucose oxidation. So the glucose is being converted through glycolysis to lactate, and which doesn't produce a lot of energy. And at the same time, the mitochondria are burning fats. And so we're essentially and this by the way happens anytime we're under stress, is we start to shift to that sort of metabolic state, the state of glycolysis alongside fat oxidation. We see it, if you were to like induce any short-term stress, like going for a run or something like that. We also see it in any version of chronic stress, and we'll, kind of provide some examples here, not only of insulin resistance, but also, cardiovascular disease and fatty liver disease, that the same metabolic state is seen. You also see it in cancer as well. And, there's this focus in cancer on the fact that the cancer cells are using the glucose and converting it to lactate, which is true. Again, that's a sign of a very deranged metabolism. It's not a carbohydrate problem, it's a metabolism problem. But you also have cancer cells using fatty acids and amino acids and things like that too. So I think it's been oversimplified, much like the insulin resistant state, which again, I would characterize just like those other stress processes of a state of elevated fat oxidation, elevated fat release in lipolysis, and very poor glucose oxidation. And so this idea that we need to fix our ability to burn fat and we need to become metabolically flexible is, I would say, entirely misplaced on, like, the focus is entirely misplaced. And instead, we want to focus on correcting our capacity for burning glucose efficiently as a fuel, as opposed to trying to burn more fat, which is actually already happening in these scenarios. And we can say, all right, in insulin resistance, we're burning more fat and we're not burning glucose well, so let's avoid glucose. And you can do that and avoid the problem. Your glucose levels will come down, your insulin will come down, but we're not actually fixing the capacity for using the glucose. We're just kind of running on these backup pathways, which we're already running on. We're already using the fat as the fuel, and we're just kind of avoiding the problem by taking out the glucose.
Yeah. And did you want to share anything regarding that? Okay.
Sure. Yeah. And so again, this will be maybe a bit of a preview. We'll be going through insulin resistance in a few episodes, the Energy Balance podcast, and digging into all of it in a bit more detail. But here's kind of like some overview quotes in terms of some of these things that I've mentioned. So when it comes to insulin resistance, there's a paper titled Insulin, Growth Hormone, and Sport. And they say that even under conditions of extreme ketoacidosis, there's no significant membrane barrier to glucose uptake. The block occurs lower down in the metabolic pathway, where the excess of ketones competitively blocks the metabolites of glucose entering the Krebs cycle. This is basically just talking about how insulin resistance is not an insulin signaling problem, which is a very related conversation, but a little tangential. But then they state, under these conditions, glucose is freely transported into the cell, but the pathway of metabolism is effectively blocked at the entry point to the Krebs cycle by the excess of metabolites arising from fat and protein breakdown. As a result of this competitive block at the entry point to the Krebs cycle, intracellular glucose metabolites increase, damming back throughout the glycolytic pathway, leading to accumulation of free intracellular glucose and inhibiting initial glucose phosphorylation. And then they talk about, I'll just finish it out here, at least in the last sentence, where they say, thus, under conditions of ketoacidosis, glucose metabolism, but not glucose uptake, is impaired as a direct consequence of the metabolism of fat. And they refer to the glucose fatty acid cycle, which is now known as the Randle cycle. And again, this is something that there's a lot more to unpack here, but just as far as a broad, big picture kind of idea, we're seeing in diabetes and insulin resistance a situation where the glucose metabolism is impaired and fatty acid, as a result, fatty acid oxidation is favored, kind of like we were talking about earlier. If there's a lack of energy, we need to force the upregulation of that, and we'll do it through fat. And we see the exact same thing play out in fatty liver disease and in cardiovascular disease. And so we'll just share those quotes really quickly, where the first one, they state, lipid oxidation products in the pathogenesis of non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. This is in fatty liver disease. That's the title of the paper. And they state, in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, both lipid oxidation and the TCA cycle are enhanced, suggesting that hepatocytes try to counter excess lipid by increasing oxidation. The higher production of reducing equivalents by lipid oxidation causes an overflow of electrons throughout the mitochondrial respiratory chain, resulting in higher free radical generation. This may lead in turn to mitochondrial dysfunction with consequent progression of liver pathology. So they're essentially saying that fatty liver disease is this state of excess lipids, which also involves excess fatty acid oxidation. We also see excess lipolysis in this state, and that this is actually something that further drives the pathology by increasing reactive oxygen species production and increasing oxidative stress there and furthering it along. And we see the exact same thing in cardiovascular disease. And so this is a paper titled Mitochondrial Fatty Acid Oxidation Alterations in Heart Failure, Ischemic Heart Disease, and Diabetic Cardiomyopathy. And they state that in many forms of heart disease, including heart failure, ischemic heart disease, and diabetic cardiomyopathies, changes in cardiac mitochondrial energy metabolism contribute to contractile dysfunction and to a decrease in cardiac efficiency. Specific metabolic changes include a relative increase in cardiac fatty acid oxidation rates and an uncoupling of glycolysis from glucose oxidation. In heart failure, overall mitochondrial oxidative metabolism can be impaired, while in ischemic heart disease, energy production is impaired due to a limitation of oxygen supply. In both of these conditions, residual mitochondrial fatty acid oxidation dominates over mitochondrial glucose oxidation. In diabetes, the ratio of cardiac fatty acid oxidation to glucose oxidation also increases, although primarily due to an increase in fatty acid oxidation and an inhibition of glucose oxidation. And then this last part, which I think is worth mentioning, they then state recent evidence suggests that therapeutically regulating cardiac energy metabolism by reducing fatty acid oxidation and or increasing glucose oxidation can improve cardiac function of the ischemic heart, the failing heart, and in diabetic cardiomyopathies. So what they're saying here is really notable. One, we see impaired glucose oxidation in the heart in these situations. We see an excess reliance on fatty acid oxidation. And you also see this uncoupling of glycolysis from glucose oxidation. So we're running the glucose through glycolysis, we're producing lactate, but we're not going through the Krebs cycle. We're not going to the electron transport chain. And then the other thing is, if you either increase glucose oxidation, you increase glucose burning, or you reduce fat burning, that actually improves cardiac function. It actually helps to reverse the state. So it's also saying that this is actually causative here, is the increase in fat burning is actually part of the driving pathology here. And the lack of glucose burning is also driving the pathology here. So if somebody is suggesting, you're insulin resistant or dealing with cardiovascular disease or fatty liver, you should be shifting away from the carbs because those, you're not using them well, which isn't even said. Really, they just say carbs are the problem. So you should be using fat. Well, in doing so, you're actually driving that pathology further by avoiding the problem, which is problems with glucose oxidation, but also just inherently increasing fatty acid oxidation further, in this case, impairs cardiac function. In the case of fatty liver, drives further inflammation and oxidative stress, driving the pathology. And insulin resistance, same thing. So yeah, it's the exact opposite of really what we should be doing, and something that I think is still pervasive and will continue to pervade for quite a while, that fat burning is the solution when really it's part of the problem.
Interesting. Yeah. And what would you say? So would you say that like having more of a balanced diet is like ideal for most people as opposed to just cutting out a macronutrient?
Yeah. I think we have needs for both fat and carbs. I'm not saying go on a very low fat diet. I don't think we should ignore the cost of that or the cost of a low carb diet. So I would say we need both. The amount can vary. And if we're insulin resistant and overweight, we already have a lot of fat circulating, so we might not need as much. Maybe we only need to get 20 to 25% of our fat intake, of our calorie intake from fats in a case like that. But in someone who's not in that case, 30, 35, 40% of calories from fat can be totally fine. And, kind of on the carb side as well, 40%, 50%, depending on the situation. And again, the thing that people commonly say is, this makes sense if you're already insulin sensitive and you're active, but if you're not, if you're insulin resistant, that's when you need to reduce the carbs and you need to favor the fat. But as we just described, that actually contributes to the pathology. And again, a little sneak peek of some of those episodes that'll be on my podcast is that there's these studies where they increase carbohydrate intake in people who are insulin resistant or who have type 2 diabetes. And it helps to reverse the insulin resistance. It helps to increase insulin sensitivity because part of the driving pathology is the fat burning itself. It's not the only part, right? We talked about endotoxin, we talked about PUFA. There are a number of other factors, but it is part of the thing driving it. And again, that doesn't mean we want zero fat. We never want to burn any fat, but it just means we don't want to be only burning fat, especially in the tissues that need to be burning carbs for optimal function.
And if you're going to have 20-25% of your diet being fat, mainly the saturated fats, obviously, right?
Yeah, saturated and monounsaturated. Yeah,
and monounsaturated. So the things that you're cooking in, or obviously you're going to get fats, the healthy fats from eating, meat and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, meat, dairy. If we
Meat,
digest
dairy.
the dairy well, it's always a caveat, and there's certain, we kind of mentioned nuts and seeds before. There's a couple that are very low in PUFA, like macadamia nuts and coconut. So those are fine sources as well.
What about peanut
and
butter?
cocoa, like chocolate.
What about peanut butter?
Yeah, peanut butter is
it's not even a nut, but
right, a
peanuts
legume.
aren't a legume, right?
But yeah,
Are
they're
they high
generally,
in PUFA?
yeah, very high. There is
Okay.
one variety of high
Okay.
oleic peanuts that are actually very, very low in PUFA. They're hard to find, and
Tiger
there's not
nuts?
very many products made with them. What's that?
Tiger nuts?
I've
Have
never
you
heard
heard
of
of them?
tiger nuts, or
Oh,
like I don't know what their fat
okay.
composition is. But
What's
yeah,
your
the vast majority of peanuts and peanut butters and all nut butters, almond butter, walnuts, all that will be very high in poof. But again, macadamia nut is an exception, coconut's an exception. Hazelnuts are kind of okay. They're not ideal, but not as bad as some of the others. So
I just love peanut butter. I got away from it for a while. I've gotten back, but it's like my one little vice. I guess we could have one vice here or there, right?
yeah, well, and I would maybe try to source one of the high oleic peanut butter options instead. So
Okay. Do you have any vices, Jay? If
not
you if
in
you were gonna
particular.
cheat on,
I mean, so for me personally, when I was low carb, when I was fasting, when I was doing cyclical keto, I felt the need to cheat, right? I would, and it would be, I mean, I was normally in terms of commitment and willpower, like I was pretty strong, like it was very rare
right?
that that I would ever really kind of make an exception. But over time, especially as I started getting into these ideas that carbs maybe weren't so bad, I started to allow myself to
Hmm.
quote cheat a little bit. And at that point, and even prior to that on low calorie diets, like because I would just try to eat less calories to get leaner. And I would definitely, binge, like really, really binge, finish off a whole thing of brownies or, you know, sleeves of Oreos or chocolate, like bags of chocolate chips or something. Like I could do that pretty easily. But when it was, keto low carb, I would, sometimes we would make, I mentioned, Mike and I met in college. So around this time, we would kind of give each other excuses to eat some of these things. So sometimes it started out with like pounds of berries, frozen berries and just eating them out of the bag. But sometimes we would do, coconut flour cookies or things like that.
This is when you were low carb. You're talking about
Yeah, yeah.
that would be what you would splurge on. I mean, now you're eating. What would you say? Like when we talk about carbs and getting 40 to 50% of your diet from that potentially. Would you say mainly that's fruit, honey, and like maybe just like sweet potato or things like that?
Yeah, well, and so that's what I was kind of going to get at is at the moment I don't really feel a need to diverge from what I
Right.
eat like I did at the time. Like I don't feel that. And if I do, it's like I'll have a couple bites of something, but the hunger signals are just like perfectly in line with what I'm eating. It's not like I could never eat now what I did eat then. Like I couldn't binge. Like I eat more on a daily basis, but I couldn't binge like I did at that point. I mean, I would, I don't know, like at some of those all you can eat steakhouses, like Brazilian steakhouses. Like I would eat till I was sick, and I couldn't do that now. Like I just don't have the capacity for it. But because the hunger signals I think are much better regulated. Whereas before, it's like you can eat way past when you're full because the hunger signals are just chronic. But you're asking about carb sources. So for me, fruits, dried fruits, fruit juices, honey, maple syrup, those are primary sources, but I do a decent amount of starch
And
as
when you're
well. So
Yeah. And I was just going to start to interrupt you, but starches, so like white potato, sweet potato, and when typically I'll have them, I'll cook them in coconut oil.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's perfect. And I'll do some
Yeah.
plantains and white rice as well.
Okay.
Yeah. And those are, I think, in people who struggle with weight gain, the starches are things I'd be more cautious about. But I know for me, especially with how my metabolism is currently, I need to have those. It's just due to food source availability and everything, it would be too hard to get enough without some starch sources.
Yeah. And what I will say, I know, as far as satiety is concerned, I know white potato is fairly satiating food, which is good. I think a positive thing. I mean, I know it's not the end all, but
Yeah, well, and I think when we're low carb, we lose sight of how many carbs are in things, and we think that you eat a bit of fruit and on a high carb diet now. And
right.
I think people don't realize it's not easy when you're coming from low carb to eat 200 grams of carbs in a day, and that's still low. Like low maybe digging into moderate, but like
Right.
low is really like 150 grams or lower in most cases. So we're just getting past that, and it's like a lot of people struggle with it. And I don't think you would just want to jump into 300 grams of carbs if you're eating 20. But I think people get surprised also. It's not easy to eat 200 grams of carbs from potatoes, like you're saying, or
Or
fruit. And
blueberries. I mean, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, there's impossible.
yeah, right.
Yeah. And it's funny how, we think like we eat a banana, it's like we're now on a high carb diet. And bananas are dense, right? They're dense as far as fruits go. But yeah, it takes a lot of carbs to fuel yourself. So
Yeah. Well, this was good, Jay. I think we hit on some good topics here. Omega 3s. We got into weight gain and fat burning, calories in, calories out. Is there anything else you want to add before we sort of sum it up?
not too much. I think with each of those topics, those are things I've dug into in more detail in articles on my website and podcast episodes. So I would refer people to those if they're hungry for more and their kind of, interest is piqued. I certainly don't subscribe to the idea that, I shared one study, so now we should all be fully convinced and change everything we're doing. Like if you're eating omega 3s and you've been listening to all these other people supporting their usage, it's okay to be skeptical. It's a good thing. I'm not expecting that you then walk away from this and throw out everything, throw all the omega 3s in the garbage. But I would say hopefully it piqued your curiosity enough to dig in a little further, and maybe we'll get to that point. So that would be my suggestion. The other thing I'll mention as well is, we were talking about fat sources and carb sources and, the concerns with fatty chicken and pork. And I have a food guide, an energy balance food guide that kind of lays that all out very nicely in a one-page infographic. And so you can get an idea of which foods are optimal from that standpoint and which foods are going to be highest in PUFA. And it also has a separate scale. So we talked about endotoxin and digestion, and it has a separate scale to consider if we're dealing with some digestive issues. We might want to be more careful about certain foods than others. Whereas if we don't have digestive issues, they might be totally fine. So I have two different scales on there. One's like a general metabolic energy balance type scale, and the other's more digestion focused. So it can be a really helpful resource for listeners. And if they'd like to download that, they can head over to jayfeldmanwellness.com/guide.
Excellent. Yeah. And I'll definitely put that in the show notes, and I'll include the studies that we cited today that, if you weren't watching on YouTube, that if you wanted to look up and read them yourself. Cause like you said, this is not about necessarily like saying this is all the end all, but do your own research. And this is just, this is one perspective. And obviously you hear there's a lot out there. So I think everyone has to sort of do their own due diligence and come up with their own conclusions.
Definitely. I think it's so important to take that authority back and not subscribe to some, figure or authoritarian source that says something. And, anything that goes against that is now, conflicting with like ourselves. And, anyway, so yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think we want to take that authority back and take learning and research back into our own hands as well. And so that's what I try to do with my podcasts and articles and resources, is give people those tools and point them in directions to help make that process a bit easier.
All right, Jay. Well, right on that note, my dogs are barking. So thanks for coming on again. I love it. Appreciate it. And jayfeldmanwellness.com. Have a great rest of the day, and thanks for coming on.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Brian. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I understand there are millions of other podcasts out there, and you've chosen to listen to mine, and I appreciate that. Check out the show notes at briangrin.com for everything that was mentioned in this episode. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend or family member that's looking to get their body back to what it once was. Thanks again, and have a great day.